Welcome back. Tonight we travel west across the long sea to a place where two cities sit one above the other on the same coast. Above, on the bright cliffs, there is Piltover, the city of clean towers and inventors and tall glass windows that catch the morning light. Below, in the long canyon that runs down to the harbor, there is Zaun, the city of green lamps and old iron and slow drifting smoke. They are not really two cities at all. They are one place, told in two voices, and tonight we are going to listen to both of them. There is nothing here to follow closely. There is nothing to remember, nothing to miss. The story will simply continue, quietly, for a long while. If your eyes grow heavy, let them. If your thoughts begin to drift, let them drift. The cities are old and patient, and they will wait for you, and the telling will keep on going whether you are listening or not. That is the whole idea. Just settle in and let the story carry you. We will begin where the cities themselves began, at the edge of the sea, on a tall stretch of cliffs above a long, sheltered bay, far to the west. Long before there were towers on the cliffs or lamps in the canyon, there was only the coast. The land in that part of the world bent inward toward itself, narrowing into a thin neck of stone that joined two great land masses, with the sea on either side. Ships passing from east to west had to round the long way, days and days of open water, far from any shore, in weather that could turn at any hour. And ships passing from west to east had to do the same. The neck of stone was in the way of everyone, and it had been in the way for as long as anyone could remember. But on the southern side of that neck of stone, the land sloped down gently to a deep, calm bay, and on the northern side, the land dropped sharply away into another bay just as deep. Sailors had long known that if a vessel could only cross from one side to the other without rounding the long way, the trade of half the world would flow through that single narrow place. For a very long time, this was only a wish spoken on quiet evenings in distant harbors. The cliffs sat in the sun, and the gulls turned above them, and the sea below did what the sea has always done. In time, people came. They came slowly, and they came for many reasons. Some were merchants, looking for a fair place to set down their goods. Some were craftsmen, looking for a quiet place to work. Some were simply tired of where they had been, and the cliffs were a long way from there. The first of them settled on the gentle southern slope, near the water, where boats could be drawn up onto the shingle, and where the wind off the bay was warm in summer and not too cold in winter. They built low houses out of pale stone, and they built jetties out into the water. And they began, in a small and careful way, to trade. It was not at first a city. It was a market. Ships from the south came in with grain and dyed cloth and amber and salted fish, and ships from the cold north came in with timber and furs and barrels of dark beer, and the people on the cliffs took a small share of everything that passed through their hands. They were not wealthy yet. They were not even particularly numerous. But they were patient, and they were well placed, and patience and a good harbor have built more cities in the world than ambition ever has. The years went on. More boats came, and more boats came, and the small market on the slope grew into a proper waterfront. Warehouses rose behind the jetties, low and broad, with thick wooden doors and slate roofs that the rain ran cleanly off. Stables were built for the long teams of mules and oxen that hauled goods up the steep path to the top of the cliffs and back down again. There was always a path, in those early years, climbing up the face of the stone, switching back and forth between outcrops, worn smooth by the feet of porters and the hooves of animals. To climb it, even at a young man's pace, took the better part of a morning. At the top of the cliffs, in time, a second settlement began to grow. It was smaller than the harbor below, but in some ways it was the more important of the two. The merchants who could afford to do so preferred to live up where the air was cleaner and the view was wider, looking out across the long sea to the horizon. They built their houses out of the same pale stone as the harbor below, but they built them taller, and they built them with care, and they set them along the cliff edge so that every window faced the water. From up there, on a clear day, one could see ships approaching for hours before they reached the harbor, and that was a useful thing in trade. The early character of the place was not at first the bright, clever city it would one day become. It was a working place, settled by working people, run by families who had come to make a quiet living off the long sea trade. There were the families who owned the boats. There were the families who owned the warehouses. There were the families who handled the dyes from the south and the timber from the north, and the spices that arrived in small, precious sacks from places no one in town had ever seen. Each family had its own corner of the trade, and each family kept careful books, written out by hand in tall ledgers bound in brown leather, kept in locked rooms above their warehouses, watched over by clerks who lived their whole lives at the desk. These were the families that, much later, would be called the great clans of Piltover. In those first years, they were nothing of the sort. They were merchants, no different in temperament from merchants anywhere else in the world. They argued over the price of grain. They drank cheap wine at the end of a long day. They married each other's daughters, and they buried each other's parents. And they slowly built up the fortunes that would, in time, make their descendants into something more. The naming of the city came later, and the story of the naming is the sort of story that no one really remembers properly. Some said the name came from an old word in a forgotten language meaning the high place, or the place of cliffs, or the place above the sea. Others said it was simply the name of one of the first merchants who had settled there, and that the rest of the town had taken on his name for lack of a better one. Whichever is true, it does not really matter. By the time the second generation of merchants was grown and at work, the place had a name, and the name was Piltover, and ships in distant ports already knew where to bring their goods. Piltover, in its early years, was a city of trade long before it was anything else. The clever inventions for which it would later become famous, the bright workshops and the strange machines and the academies full of young apprentices, were still hundreds of years away. The hextech that would one day light its lamps and lift its great gates was not yet even a rumor on the wind. The city in those years was simpler than that. It was a city of ledgers and rope and slow, honest work, of ships coming in on the tide and ships going out again, of warm bread baked in the early hours and sold to the harbor men before dawn, of long, quiet afternoons when the wind dropped and the bay went smooth and the gulls settled on the water in long, patient lines. In the evenings, the lamps along the cliff edge were lit one by one as the light failed, and from below, from the harbor, the lit windows of the high houses looked like a low constellation strung along the rim of the world. The merchants up there sat at their long wooden tables and ate their slow suppers and looked out across the water, and they thought, in their unhurried way, about the next ship and the next season and the next small fortune to be made. It was a good place to grow up in those years. The children of the harbor families ran barefoot along the jetties and learned to swim in the cold green water of the bay. The children of the cliff families learned their letters and their numbers from tutors in quiet rooms with tall windows, and on warm afternoons they were sometimes taken down the long switchback path to see the ships at the docks. The The two halves of the town were already a little separate from each other, even then, but they were not yet very far apart. A child from the harbor and a child from the cliffs could meet on the path and walk a little way together and find that they had more in common than they had been told. And so the years went on, and the city grew slowly, in the quiet way that cities grow when they are not in any particular hurry. New jetties were built, and new warehouses, and new houses along the cliff edge. The path up from the harbor was widened, and then widened again, and then in places it was cut deeper into the stone so that carts could pass each other, coming up and going down. Bells were hung in the small temples on the cliff top, and they were rung at sunrise and at sunset, and the sound of them drifted out over the water for a long way. For a long while, this was all that Piltover was. A bright settlement on the cliffs and a busy harbor below, joined by a long climbing road, watching the long sea trade move past in slow, patient streams. The merchants kept their ledgers. The boats came and went. The lamps were lit, and the lamps were put out. And on the far side of the neck of stone, the other bay sat empty and waiting, with no settlement on its shore at all, and the wish of the sailors, that some way might be found to cross from one side to the other, drifted on in the talk of distant harbors, year after year, without any answer. In time, the city above would need a city below, and so beneath the cliffs, another place began to grow. It did not happen all at once. Nothing in either of these cities ever happened all at once. The lower city grew the way the upper city had grown, slowly and without anyone really planning for it, in the gaps and the cracks and the places no one was watching. The cliffs on which Piltover stood were not, in truth, a single solid wall of stone. They were cut, in places, by long, narrow canyons that ran inland from the bay, deep and winding and shadowed even at noon. For most of the early years of Piltover, these canyons had been left alone. They were difficult to reach, difficult to build in, and the air at the bottom of them moved slowly and did not smell good. The merchants on the cliff edge had no use for them. The sailors at the harbor had no reason to enter them. They sat below the city, quiet and forgotten, full of nothing but old, fallen stone and the small creatures that did not mind the dark. But as Piltover grew, the city above began, in time, to need places to put the things it did not wish to look at. Every city, sooner or later, comes to this. There were tanneries which gave off a strong and difficult smell. There were the small forges where iron was worked, which threw up black smoke that no one wanted drifting in through their windows. There were the slaughter yards, and the dye works, and the long, low sheds where lime was burned, and the cluttered workhouses where rope was tarred and barrels were sealed. None of these were the sort of work that the merchants on the cliff edge wished to see from their tall windows, and none of them paid enough to argue with. And so, one by one, these trades drifted downward. They drifted into the canyons that ran below the city, into the long shadowed clefts in the stone, where the wind off the sea did not reach and where the smells they made could settle out of sight. The first of the lower buildings were not built so much as they were leaned, set against the canyon walls and braced with whatever timber the harbor men had to spare. They were workshops at first, and then they were lodgings for the workers who could not afford to climb the long path back up every night. And then they were small shops to sell food and drink to those lodgers. And then they were more lodgings still, until the canyons that had been empty for so long began to fill with a quiet, working life of their own. This was the beginning of Zaun. It did not yet have that name, or perhaps it had several names, depending on who was asked. The harbor men called it the Lower Town, or the Works, or simply down there, with a small turn of the head toward the cliffs. The merchants on the high windows scarcely spoke of it at all. The people who lived in it called it home, and they called it by the names of its small streets and small corners, and they did not, in those years, give the whole of it a single name. The whole of it did not yet feel like a single place. The work of the lower city was hard, and it was, for the most part, not well paid. The tanners stood for long hours over their vats. The smiths kept the small forges burning through the night. The lime burners breathed in the white dust of their trade and coughed it out again in the early morning. The rope makers worked their long ropes along the length of narrow alleys, walking backward and forward all day. The lower city, in those first years, was a poorer place than the city above it, and no one who lived there had any particular illusion about that. And yet it was its own place, and its people were proud of it in their own way. They were proud of being good at their work. They were proud of the things they made: the long oiled ropes and the heavy barrels and the strong iron fittings that held the ships of the harbor together. They were proud of knowing every small turn of their own streets, of being able to walk home in the dark without a lamp, of understanding the long, slow rhythm of the workshops in a way that no one above could ever quite understand. The lower city was not the upper city, and the people who lived in it did not, in those years, much wish that it were. Above all, the lower city was vertical, in a way that the upper city was not. Piltover sat broad and bright along the cliff edge, with room to spread itself out in all directions, with wide streets and tall windows and gardens behind its houses. The lower city had no such room. It had only the narrow canyons in the stone, and so it grew the only way it could, which was upward and downward at the same time. Buildings were stacked on buildings. Walkways were strung from one canyon wall to the other. Wooden stairs climbed up the outsides of the lodgings and joined other stairs that climbed up further still. A street in the lower city was not always a street on the ground. Sometimes it was a long iron balcony, 100 feet above the next street down, and the next street down was itself 100 feet above the one below that. In time, the lower city came to have its own layers, and the people who lived there came to know those layers by name. At the top, where the lower city met the lower edge of Piltover, there was the level that came to be called the Promenade. It was the brightest of the lower levels, the one closest to the open sky, and it was where those who had done well in the lower city came to live and to spend their money. The lamps there were the warmest. The shops were a little finer. From the promenade on a clear day, one could look up between the buildings and see a thin, pale strip of true sky, and that was something worth living near. Below the promenade, in the long middle of the lower city, there was the level that came to be called the entresol. This was where most of the work and most of the trade went on. The entresol was the most populated of the levels, and it was the most varied. It had its workshops and its lodgings and its small, noisy markets, and it had its taverns and its bathhouses and the long, covered walkways that joined one side of the canyon to the other. The light in the entresol was a filtered light. It came down from above in long, slanting beams, and it caught on the iron railings and the window panes and the rising threads of steam from the forges below, and it made the air at midday almost golden, almost. And then, at the very bottom, there was the level that came to be called the sump. The sump was the lowest of the levels, the deepest into the stone, the furthest from the open sky. Almost no light reached it from above. The work there was the hardest work in the lower city, and the air was the heaviest, and the people who lived there were the poorest. The sump had its own kind of pride too, in its own quiet way, a pride in surviving the hardest of the work and the longest of the hours. But it was a hard place to make a life in, and everyone in the lower city knew it. So the lower city, by the time it had a shape, was not one place but 3 places, stacked on top of each other in the long stone canyons. The promenade above, the entresol in the middle, the sump at the bottom. And above all 3 of them, far above, sat Piltover on the cliff edge, with its tall windows and its quiet evenings and its long view of the sea. The 2 cities, the bright one above and the working one below, were joined by the long climbing paths and by the cargo lifts that had begun to be built into the canyon walls. Lifts of heavy timber hauled by ropes and counterweights, slow and creaking, that carried goods and people up and down between the levels day and night. There was trade between them, constantly. The lower city sent up its barrels and its rope and its worked iron and its tanned leather. The upper city sent down its fine cloth and its books and its small, clever instruments and its bottles of southern wine. And it sent down also the simple things, the bread and the cheese and the salt fish, which the lower city ate more of than the upper city ever did. Carts went up. Carts came down. The 2 cities were tied to each other by 1,000 small daily exchanges, and in those years, for the most part, they did not much mind the tie. The lower city needed the upper city to buy what it made. The upper city needed the lower city to make what it sold. And so they held together, in their separate ways, on either side of a long and quiet understanding. The character of the 2 cities, by now, was settling into something that could be recognized at a glance. Piltover was the city of broad streets and quiet ledgers, of careful clerks and patient merchants, of clean windows and well-kept gardens, of long suppers eaten slowly while the sea darkened below. The lower city, which by then was beginning, in some mouths, to be called by the name Zaun, was the city of iron and steam and warm yellow light, of small workshops open late into the night, of the steady creaking of cargo lifts in the dark, of the voices of workmen calling to each other across the narrow canyons. The 2 cities looked different. They sounded different. They smelled different. They were, even then, beginning to feel like 2 different kinds of places, even though they were truly one. It was said, in those early years, that you could tell whether a person had come up from the lower city or down from the upper one by the way they walked. Those from above walked with a long, even stride, used to broad, open streets. Those from below walked with a shorter, surer step, used to narrow ways and uncertain footing. It was a small thing, and probably it was not entirely true, but people in the harbor said it, and people in the workshops said it. And a saying that 2 cities both repeat about each other often turns out to be a saying with some truth in it, in the end. And yet, for all the small differences that were beginning to gather between them, the 2 cities in those years still belonged to each other. A child born in the sump could climb the long stairs to the promenade and then take the cargo lift higher still and stand, at the end of the day, on the cliff edge of Piltover, looking out over the long sea and feel that the whole of it was theirs. A merchant's son from the bright cliff houses could ride one of the lifts down through the layers of the lower city and walk the lit alleys of the entresol and sit in one of its small taverns and feel, by the end of the evening, that he had been welcomed somewhere not quite his own, but not quite foreign either. The 2 cities were close in those days, in a way that, much later, they would not always be. And so the years went on, as they had for the upper city before. The lower levels grew busier. The lifts grew larger. New workshops opened and old ones closed. The names of the streets settled into their long use. Children were born in the sump and grew up in the sump and went to work in the same workshops their parents had worked in, and they were not unhappy. The promenade gained its lampposts. The entresol gained its covered walkways. The long, quiet evenings drifted past, one after another, in both cities at once, and each city kept on doing what it had always done, and the long climb between them stayed open, in both directions, all the years through. For a long while the two cities held together, joined by stone and trade. Then came the day the water rose. The disaster that came to the lower city, when it came, had been many years in the making, and the people who lived through it would, for the rest of their lives, speak of it in two different ways. Some called it the sundering, because of what it broke. Others called it the rising, because of what it brought up out of the deep. Both names were true in their own way, and both names are still used, and both names mean, in the end, the same long, sad afternoon. The thing that brought the disaster about was a piece of ambition, the sort of ambition that cities sometimes get when they have grown wealthy and busy and confident, and when they have begun to think that the long shape of the world is something that might, with enough patience and enough money and enough clever engineering, be quietly altered to suit them. The ambition was the old wish of the sailors, the one that had drifted in the talk of distant harbors for so many years, that some way might be found to cross from the southern bay to the northern bay without rounding the long way through open water. The wish had never gone away. It had only grown, as the trade through the cliffs had grown, and by now it was strong enough that those with the means to do something about it had at last begun to plan. The plan was a great canal. It was to be cut through the narrow neck of stone that joined the two great land masses, the same long neck that held Piltover on its high cliff and the lower city in its long canyons. If the canal could be made, ships would no longer have to round the long way. They would pass through the cliffs themselves, from one sea to the other, in a single day. The trade of half the world, the old saying went, would flow through that single narrow cut, and the city that controlled the cut would grow wealthy beyond anything its early merchants had imagined. The engineers who took up the project were the best who could be found. They came from the academies of the upper city and from the workshops of the lower one, and they worked together in long, careful planning sessions, drawing out their charts on great rolls of paper, calculating the slopes and the tides and the strain on the stone. They were patient and careful people. They did not rush. They understood that what they were attempting had never been done before, and they took their work seriously. And they did not, in those long planning years, make any obvious mistake that anyone could later point to. The work was, by every measure available at the time, well thought out. The construction itself took years. Whole crews of workers were hired up out of the sump and the entresol, men and women glad of the steady pay, glad of the chance to be part of something that the whole of both cities was talking about. Long trenches were cut through the stone. Great pumps were built to keep the water out of the workings. Long lines of timber bracing were set into the canyon walls. The work went forward by day and by night, in shifts that overlapped, with the slow, steady creak of cranes and the deep, regular thud of stone hammers carrying up out of the cut and into the streets of both cities. For a long while, it seemed that the work was going well. The cut grew deeper. The walls of the canal grew straighter. The engineers, in their long, careful sessions, looked at their charts and looked at their measurements and nodded to one another in the careful way that people do when they think a difficult thing is being done correctly. The merchants in the upper city counted the days. The lower city counted the wages. The whole of both cities was waiting, in its different ways, for the day the canal would open. But the cliffs had been there a very long time before any of this. The stone in them was old, and it had its own quiet patience, and it had been holding the weight of the two cities and the long memory of the sea for far longer than anyone alive could properly imagine. The engineers, for all their care, were working in something they did not fully understand. There were long faults in the stone that no chart had ever marked. There were places where the rock was thinner than it looked. There were old hollow places deep below the workings that had been hollow for so long that no one had any reason to know they were there. And so, one afternoon, on a day that began like any other day, the stone gave way. It is said that the first to know were the workers deepest in the cut, who felt a long, low shifting in the stone beneath their feet, a shifting unlike any shifting they had felt before. It is said that some of them had time to call out. It is said that some of them began to climb. It is said also that for many of them there was no time at all, and that the long sound that came up out of the cliffs that afternoon, the long, deep groan of stone settling into something it had not settled into for a very long time, was the only warning that anyone in either city ever had. The cliffs sank. They did not all sink, and they did not sink all the way, but parts of them sank, and the parts that sank were the parts in which the lower city had built itself most deeply. Whole sections of the sump, the lowest level, the level closest to the workings, went down into the new fissures that opened beneath them. The middle level shook and held, mostly, but in places it broke and slid. The upper level, the promenade, shook hardest near the cut, and barely at all in the parts furthest from it. And then, before the stone had even finished settling, the sea came in. The sea came in through the broken end of the canal, and it came in fast. It poured down into the new fissures and into the broken levels of the lower city, and it carried with it the cold green water of the southern bay and the salt of long centuries. And it went where it wished, because the stone that had held it back was no longer there. For a long while, no one in either city could quite tell what was happening, only that the water was rising in the lower streets, and that the lamps were going out, and that the long, familiar shape of the lower city was being changed, second by second, in ways that could not be undone. The people of the lower city did what people in such moments have always done. They tried to help one another. They climbed when they could climb. They reached down for the hands of those still below them. They carried children up the long stairs and onto the higher walkways. They opened their doors to strangers, and they shared what little dry space they had. The lifts ran without ceasing for as long as their cables would hold, carrying as many as could be packed onto them up to the safer levels above. The upper city, when the news at last reached it, sent down what help it could, ropes and lamps and dry clothing and food, and the bridges across the canyons were crowded all night with people moving in both directions, going down to look for the missing and coming up with whoever had been found. It is said that on that long afternoon and through the long night that followed it, the wind off the sea changed. It is said that an old wind, an old patient wind that had watched over that coast for a very long time, came in across the bay and lifted itself up over the broken cliffs and held back, for a while, the worst of what the sea was doing. It is said that walls of moving air rose where there had been no walls, and that whole streets of the middle level, which would otherwise have been lost, were kept dry through the long night by that quiet wind. The old stories give the wind a name, and they say she was once worshipped in this part of the world, long before the cliffs had a city on them at all, and they say she remembered the coast and the people on it, and came when she was needed. Whether one believes the old stories or not, it is true that the lower city did not lose as much that night as it could have lost, and the people who lived through it always afterward gave thanks, in their own quiet ways, to whatever it was that had held the worst of it back. But much was lost, even so. Many were lost. The exact count was never made, because the lower city had never been counted properly to begin with, and because the lowest level had been the level most fully changed. There were streets that had been there in the morning and were not there in the evening. There were families that had been whole at noon and were not whole at dusk. There were workshops that had stood for generations and were now under the cold green water at the bottom of the new fissures, with all that they had contained. The lower city, when the long night ended and the long gray morning came in over the broken cliffs, was no longer the lower city it had been. The upper city, in the days and weeks that followed, did what the upper city, in those days, was capable of doing. It sent down food. It sent down workers to help clear what could be cleared. It opened its halls, for a time, to those who had nowhere else to go. But the upper city was also, in its quiet way, afraid. The disaster had not been the doing of the lower city. The plan had been a plan of both cities. The engineers had come from both cities. The work had been celebrated by both cities. But the disaster had fallen on the lower city almost entirely, and the upper city, looking down into the broken canyons in those gray weeks, could not quite bring itself to take the share of the loss that, in honesty, was its own. And so, slowly, over the long months that followed, the upper city began to step back. It did not announce that it was stepping back. It did not name what it was doing. It simply, in 1,000 small daily ways, began to draw away from the affairs of the lower city, to leave them to the lower city to manage, to turn its tall windows back to the long sea and to the trade that still passed below the cliffs, as it had always passed. The clerks in the high warehouses kept their ledgers as they had always kept them. The merchants on the cliff edge ate their long suppers as they had always eaten them. And the lower city, which had once been held to the upper city by 1,000 small daily exchanges, found those exchanges thinning out, one by one, until what had been a close and constant tie had become something looser and quieter and harder to put a name to. The lower city, left more to itself than it had ever been, did what cities in such moments have always done. It carried on. It rebuilt what could be rebuilt. It mourned what could not be replaced. It set new lamps along the broken levels and strung new walkways across the new fissures and patched the long stairs and reopened the workshops that had survived. The work was slow and it was hard, and it was, in many places, never fully finished. The lower city after the sundering was not the lower city before it. It had a new shape, with deeper drops and longer falls and stranger turns, and it had a new feeling of being a place that had been left, in some quiet way, to look after itself. And out of that feeling, in time, there began to gather something new. With the upper city stepping back, there was no longer anyone in particular running the lower city's affairs from above, and there had never been anyone in particular running them from below. Into that quiet space, slowly, men and women with money and ambition and a willingness to use both began to step forward. They bought up the workshops that had been ruined. They paid for the rebuilding of the streets that had been broken. They hired the workers who had nowhere else to go, and they paid them, and they housed them, and in time they came to expect a certain loyalty in return. They were not, at first, called by any single name, but the name came to them in time, and the name was the Chem Barons, and the lower city in the long years after the sundering became, by quiet stages, a place that they ran. And so the two cities went on, no longer the same, no longer quite separate. Above, a different story was beginning to take shape. The story that began to take shape in the upper city in those long years after the sundering was a quieter story than the one below. And for a long time, it was not very much of a story at all. It was, at first, just a slow drift of curiosity. The kind of curiosity that gathers in a wealthy city when its merchants have a little more money than they know what to do with, and their sons and daughters have a little more time than the merchants ever had. It was the sort of drift that turns, by slow stages, into a habit, and then into a fashion, and then, in the end, into a way of life. What gathered in the upper city in those years was a quiet love of clever things. It began in small ways, as such loves always do. A merchant brought back from a distant port a small mechanical bird, a thing of brass and tiny gears that could be wound up with a key and would, for a few minutes, hop along a tabletop and turn its head from side to side. The bird sat on a shelf in the merchant's tall house on the cliff edge, and the merchant's children came to look at it, and the merchant's friends came to look at it. And within a year, there were workshops in the upper city making small mechanical birds of their own, some better than the original, some worse. All of them sold for good prices to people who wanted such a thing in their own tall houses. The birds were only the beginning. There came, in the years that followed, the small clockwork mice, and the singing music boxes, and the little ships in glass globes that sailed in slow circles when a hidden mechanism was turned. There came the more useful things too, the locks that could not be picked by any ordinary thief, and the long telescopes for watching ships approach from far across the sea, and the careful instruments that the navigators of the harbor came to depend on. The upper city, which had always been a city of merchants and clerks, began to discover, almost without noticing, that it was also becoming a city of makers. And the makers were good, and the things they made were good, and the things they made sold for good prices not only in the upper city itself, but in the distant ports to which the long ships of the harbor still sailed. To support all of this making, the upper city in time began to build itself a place to teach the making. It began as a single old building, the gift of a wealthy clan whose name has long since slipped out of common memory, set on a quiet street near the cliff edge with broad windows and long tables and a small workshop in the back. A handful of older makers, the best of those then alive in the upper city, came to teach there in the early years, and a handful of younger ones came to learn. And the place was at first very small and very quiet, and almost unknown outside the few families who sent their children to it. In time, this small place grew. It took in more students. It hired more teachers. It bought up the building next to it, and then the building next to that. And then, after some years, it was given the use of a long row of old warehouses near the cliff edge that had once stored the dried goods of the southern trade. The old warehouses were rebuilt with broad workshops on their lower floors and quiet study rooms on their upper floors, and the long row of them came in time to be called the college, and after that, the College of Techmaturgy, which is a long old word that means more or less, the careful study of the making of clever things. The name was somewhat grand for what the place actually was in its early years, but the upper city had grown fond of grand names, and the name stuck. It was around the college in those years that the figure who would come to be most associated with the city's long love of clever things first appeared. He was, by all accounts, very small. He was not of the same people as the merchants of the cliff edge, nor of the workers of the lower city, but of an older and quieter people who came from far away, and who, it was said, lived a great deal longer than the people of the cliffs ever did. His name was Heimerdinger, or some longer version of that name which only his oldest acquaintances ever bothered to use. And he was already, when he first came to the upper city, far older than anyone who met him would have guessed. Heimerdinger came to the upper city for the same reason the small mechanical birds had come, which is to say that he had heard, somewhere in his long, quiet travels, that the cliffs were becoming a place where careful makers were welcome. He brought with him a few small instruments of his own making, and a great many books, and a manner of speaking that was quick and high and full of small parenthetical asides, and he settled into a set of rooms above the new college. And there he stayed. He stayed for so long, and through so many slow changes in the upper city, that in time it became difficult to remember the upper city without him in it. Children who grew up in the cliff houses watched the small, bright figure of the inventor crossing the courtyards of the college, and their children watched him crossing the same courtyards, and their children's children watched him still. He was, by then, simply part of the place. Under his quiet, long teaching, the college grew. Generations of apprentices passed through it, the bright sons and daughters of the cliff clans, and, in time, the bright sons and daughters of the lower city too. When the lower city had recovered enough from the long aftermath of the sundering to send any of its children up the long stairs to learn. The college taught them the careful arts of mechanism, the slow patience of the workbench, the long discipline of measuring twice and cutting once. Out of its doors, year by year, came the makers who would in time fill the upper city with the small, clever things that came to be its trade. For a long while, this was all that the making in the upper city amounted to. It was a careful and beautiful trade, but it was a trade of mechanism, of gears and springs and small, clever levers, of things that could be wound up and would run for a little while, and then would need to be wound up again. There was no other power in it than the patient pull of a spring and the slow weight of a counterbalance. And that was, in those years, all that anyone in the upper city would have thought to ask of it. And then, by a long, slow chain of events that no one at the time could quite have followed, something else came to the upper city. It came from very far away, from across the long sea and across long deserts beyond that, from a country which most of the merchants of the cliff edge had never seen, and which most of them, if asked, could not have placed properly on a map. What came was a handful of crystals, small and pale and not at first very impressive to look at, the size of a thumb or a little larger, with a faint cool color inside them that the light caught in odd ways. The crystals had been known in their distant home for a very long time. They were taken, it was said, from old patient creatures that lived deep in the warm sands of a far country, creatures who sang quietly to one another, and who had carried these small bright stones inside themselves for ages without count. The taking of the stones was a delicate matter, and the people who did it were few, and the stones themselves, when they reached the upper city by the long, slow trade routes, were rare and very dear. But they reached the upper city in time, and once they had reached it, the careful makers of the college could not quite leave them alone. What the makers learned, by slow degrees, was that these small, pale crystals held inside them a kind of power that no spring or counterweight had ever held. The power was quiet and steady and seemed not to run down with use. A crystal set into the right mechanism could turn that mechanism without any winding for a long time, without seeming to grow tired. A crystal placed inside a lamp could light the lamp with a cool, clear light that no flame could match. A crystal joined to a heavier piece of machinery could lift weights that no hand could lift, slowly and patiently, all day if asked. The makers of the college, when they first saw what the crystals could do, looked at each other in the long, quiet way that people do when they suspect that the shape of their lives is about to change. The art that grew up around the crystals came in time to be called Hextech, which is another of those long old words that the upper city was fond of, meaning more or less the careful joining of the old hidden power of the world with the careful craft of the workbench. It was a slow art in those early years. The crystals were rare and dear and not yet well understood, and the makers worked carefully with what little of them they could obtain. They learned how to cut the crystals without shattering them. They learned how to set them into housings of brass and silver that could carry their power safely into the rest of a mechanism. They learned, after a great deal of patient failure, what kinds of work the crystals would and would not do. And they learned, slowly, the rules by which the small, bright stones could be made to serve the purposes of the cliffs. The cliff clans, watching all of this from their tall houses, were quick to see what was happening. Some of them threw in their fortunes early, paying for long expeditions to the distant country from which the crystals came, paying to bring back as many of the small, bright stones as could be brought, paying to feed the new art at the college with all the raw material it could ask for. Other clans, more careful or less imaginative, hung back at first and waited to see whether anything would come of it. Both groups, in the end, were repaid for what they had done. The clans that had thrown in early grew very wealthy on the new art, and the clans that had held back grew more modest, and the long, slow shifting of fortunes in the upper city, which had been going on quietly for 100 years, took on, in those decades, a faster and brighter shape. Out of all of this work, in time, came the first of the great Hextech gates. They were built, after many years of design, at the edge of the cliffs where the long climbing path met the upper city. Their stones were carved with care, and the great crystals were set into their highest arches with great ceremony. And on the day the first of them was lit, it is said that the whole of the upper city came out to watch. The gates, when they were running, could lift heavy goods up out of the harbor in a small fraction of the time the old cargo lifts had needed. They could move cargo from one part of the upper city to another in moments. In time they came to do still stranger things, opening for a few breaths at a time to carry ships through to distant ports, the long way around the world. The upper city, with the new gates running, became a place that the long sea trade now passed through in ways it had never quite passed through before. The fortunes of the cliff clans, on the back of this new art, rose and fell as fortunes do. Some clans rose to great heights and stayed there. Some rose for a generation and then fell back. Some had been quiet for 100 years, and then, on the strength of one well-placed investment in the new art, became suddenly very important and stayed important ever after. The college, all the while, kept on teaching, and Heimerdinger, in his quiet, long way, kept on walking the courtyards and giving his quick, high lectures and watching the young apprentices come and go, and the upper city went on becoming, by slow degrees, the place that the rest of the world would in time come to call the city of progress. It was a slow change, and a careful one, and it was not, in those years, a change that anyone in either city would have called dangerous. The Hextech art was kept inside the college, and the crystals were kept inside the strong rooms of the clans that owned them, and the new gates were watched over by careful keepers who knew exactly what they were doing. The trouble that would, much later, come of the new art was still a long way off, and no one in those years had any particular reason to expect it. It would take two young inventors, working long nights in a quiet workshop, to turn that science into something the world had never seen. The two young inventors of whom the old stories speak came from different parts of the cliffs, and they came to their work by different paths, and yet by the time they met, the long, quiet shape of their lives had already begun to bend, in its own way, toward the other. Their names were Jace and Victor, and the long telling of what they did together and what they did apart is one of the longer and slower threads in the story of the two cities. And tonight, it is the thread that the night turns toward. Jace was born in the upper city, into a clan of careful makers, the kind of clan that kept a small, respected workshop along one of the quieter streets near the cliff edge. His family was not among the very wealthiest of the cliff clans, but they were comfortable, and they were well thought of, and they had been making careful instruments of brass and silver and wood for a long time. Jace grew up in the back rooms of that workshop, watching the older makers at their long benches, learning by long-looking the small, slow movements of the trade. From the time he was very young, it was understood by everyone around him that he had a gift for the work. He took to it as some children take to music or to drawing, easily and gladly and without much fuss, and by the time he was old enough to be apprenticed in earnest, the older makers of the family had already begun to ask him quiet questions about how a certain piece might be improved. What set Jace apart from the other gifted children of the upper city was not in the end only the quickness of his hands. There were many quick hands in the upper city by then. What set him apart was the long, quiet idea that had taken hold of him early and never quite let go. The idea was a simple one, and like most simple ideas, it took some time to say properly. It was that the careful, clever things made in the upper city, the small mechanisms and the bright lamps and the long polished instruments, ought to be made not only for the wealthy clans of the cliffs and their distant trading partners, but also for everyone, for any person who needed such a thing, no matter where they lived or what they could afford to pay. Jace, even as a young apprentice at the college, would speak of this from time to time in his long, quiet way, and the older makers would listen, and they would nod politely, and then they would go back to making the small, expensive things they had been making before. The idea, in those years, had no particular place to land, but it sat in Jace, and it grew. Victor came to the upper city by a longer road. He was born in the lower city, in the lowest of its levels, in the long sump where the air was always heaviest, and the lamps were always greenest, and the work was always hardest. His family was not a family of makers. His family were workers in one of the long, quiet industries that the sump kept going year after year, and they did not have a great deal to spare for the raising of a sickly child. But Victor was sickly, from very early on. He was small for his age, and his bones did not grow as evenly as other children's bones, and one of his legs was always a little weaker than the other, and there were long stretches of his childhood when he could not run with the other children of his street, and so he sat instead in the small front room of his family's lodging, and he read. What he read, for the most part, were books that had drifted down somehow from the upper city, second-hand or third-hand or fourth-hand, books on mechanism and on the careful arts of the workbench, books that he did not at first fully understand, and that he came back to year after year until he did. He taught himself, in those long, quiet stretches, a great deal of what the College of Techmaturgy was teaching its apprentice in much grander rooms far above. By the time he was old enough to walk the long stairs up to the upper city on his own, with the help of the long, thin cane he had begun to use, he already knew, in his quiet, careful way, what he wanted to do with his life. He wanted to make things. He wanted to make the kinds of things that the books spoke of, the kinds of things that came out of the bright workshops of the cliffs. And so, on the strength of a few small mechanisms he had built at home out of scrap from the workshops where his parents worked, he made the long climb to the upper city and presented himself at the doors of the college and asked, in his quiet, careful voice, to be allowed in. The college, in those years, did not often take students from the lower city, but it took him. The older teachers, looking over the small mechanisms he had brought with him, looked at one another in the long, careful way that they were used to, looking at one another when something unusual had walked into the room. They gave him a place. He took it. He moved into a small set of rooms near the college, and he set to work. And for the next several years, he was as quiet a student as the college had ever taken in, and as gifted a one. He did not speak much. He did not go to the long dinners that the other apprentice went to in the cliff houses of their friends. He sat at his bench, late into the long evenings, and he worked, and he learned, and the older teachers, watching him from a distance, came in time to think that he was perhaps the most quietly remarkable student the college had ever had. It was at the college that Jace and Victor met. The exact moment of their meeting is not the kind of thing that the long telling of these stories has bothered to preserve, and there are several different small accounts of how it happened, and none of them quite agree with each other. What the accounts do agree on is that the meeting was not at first dramatic. They were two young apprentices at the same long bench, working on different small projects, and they fell, by the slow accidents of nearby work, into a quiet, ongoing conversation. The conversation was about the small problems of mechanism that the two of them were each working on, and then it was about the larger problems of the new Hextech art that had begun to be talked about at the college. And then, by long, slow stages, it was about what the new art might one day be made to do, if it could only be properly understood. Jace, with his long, quiet idea that the clever things of the cliffs ought to be made for everyone, found in Victor a listener who took the idea seriously. Victor, with his long, careful understanding of the books and his quiet skill at the workbench, found in Jace a partner who could see, often before he could finish a sentence, where one of his careful designs was going. The two of them began to spend long evenings together at the college, and then long evenings together in a small workshop that Jace's family had let him use on one of the quiet streets near the cliff edge. And then, in time, long evenings together that went on so far into the night that the lamps of the upper city had begun to go out around them, one by one. And the only lamp still burning on that particular street was the one above their bench. What they made together, in those long evenings, were the first of the careful joinings of the new Hextech art with the older craft of the workbench that the upper city had not yet quite imagined. They made a small, bright lamp that would burn for years without tending. They made a careful mechanism for lifting weights, smaller than the great gates at the cliff edge, but easier to build and easier to set up in places that needed it. They made instruments of measurement so fine that the older makers of the college, when at last they were shown them, sat quietly for a long time before they could find the words to say what they thought. The two of them, working together in their quiet workshop, were doing by slow stages what the college had been trying and failing to do for a long time. They were making the new art ordinary. They were making it useful in small ways, in the small ways that a thing has to become useful before it can become useful in large ways. And the small, clever things that they made together began, in time, to drift out from the workshop and into the streets of the upper city, and from there, in slow ripples, into the lower city as well. In those years, the friendship of the two of them was the long, quiet center of the work. They were not alike. Jace was the more outward of the two, the more easily liked at the long dinners, the more comfortable speaking in front of the older makers of the college. Victor was the quieter, more given to the bench than to the conversation, more comfortable with the work itself than with the talk about the work. but each of them brought what the other did not have. And for a long while, the two of them, working together, were one of the bright, slow facts of the upper city. The sort of thing that the children of the cliff clans grew up hearing spoken of and looked forward to seeing for themselves, when at last they were old enough to be brought into the workshops where such work was being done. The two of them, after several long years of this, were no longer apprentice but full members of the college in their own right. Jace, on the strength of the work, was offered the patronage of one of the great cliff clans, and then of another. And he took, in the end, the patronage that he thought would best serve the long, quiet idea that had stayed with him since boyhood. The idea that the new art ought to be made for everyone. Victor, in his own quieter way, was given his own laboratory at the college, and his own small staff of careful younger apprentice, and the freedom to follow the slow turn of his own thoughts wherever they led him. For a while longer, the two of them still worked together. For a while longer still, the lamp on their old workshop street still burned late into the night. But the long shape of a friendship like that, when it begins to change, does not always change in ways that either friend can quite explain to himself at the time. Victor, in his quiet, long way, had begun to think, in those years, about something that the older books had not quite given him an answer to. He had begun to think about his own body, the body that had been weak from his earliest years, the body that had given him pain for as long as he could remember, the body that the long climb up from the sump had never quite let him forget. He had begun to think about what it might mean to make a body the way one made a clever mechanism, with care and patience, replacing what did not work with what did. He had begun, in his careful, quiet way, to wonder whether the new art might one day be used to do for the body of a person what it had so easily been made to do for a lamp or a lift. It was a long, quiet wondering, and at first it stayed inside him, where no one could see it. In time, Victor would come to believe the flesh itself was a weakness, and he would set about answering that belief in his own way. The road he took toward that answer was long, and it was a road that took him, by slow stages, away from the bright workshop on the quiet street, and away from the long evenings at the bench beside his friend. Jace, for his part, stayed with his own long, quiet idea, and the road that led him further into that idea took him too, by slow stages, into other rooms and other work. The two of them did not, in any single moment that could be named, decide to part. They simply, over a long stretch of years, came to spend less of their time at the same bench, and then less still, until the lamp that had once burned late on that quiet workshop street was, more nights than not, lit by only one of them at a time, or by neither. What each of them did with the long years that followed is a longer telling than this part of the night can hold, and much of it the long story has already told in its own way, and will tell again in other forms. The long, careful art they had made together did not stop. It went on, in their own hands and in the hands of others, and the upper city went on being shaped by it, and the lower city, in its own way, went on being shaped by it too. The two of them are remembered together, even now, even in the parts of their lives when they were no longer often in the same room, because what they made together was the kind of making that, once it is done, cannot quite be separated again into the work of one or the other. The long telling holds them together, even when the long telling knows that, by the end, they had each in their own way gone a long way down their own road. While the two inventors worked above, below them another childhood was unfolding in the lanes of Zaun. The lanes of Zaun, by the time the long story turns to them, were already very old. They had grown in the long years after the sundering into a settled place, the way that even broken places, given enough time, become settled in their own way. The streets had their names. The corners had their stories. The children who grew up there learned, almost before they learned to read, which alleys to walk down at dusk and which to leave alone, which lifts were safe to ride and which were not, which doors in the long iron walls would open if a child knocked at them and which would stay shut. It was a hard place to grow up in, but it was also, in the long, quiet way of such places, a place where the people who lived in it looked after one another, because there was no one else to do the looking after. At the center of one such corner of the lanes, in those years, stood a man whom the rest of the corner had come, in time, to depend on. His name was Vander, and he was, by the time the children of the story were young, no longer a young man himself. He had broad shoulders and a slow, patient way of speaking, and a long, quiet history that he did not often speak about, and he ran a small tavern on a quiet street in one of the lower levels, a place with a wooden sign above the door and a warm light inside, and a long bar that the regulars sat at most evenings. The tavern was not a grand place. It was the sort of place where the workers of the nearby shops came in after their long shifts and sat for an hour and went home, and where the older folk of the street came in the afternoons to sit by the small fire and talk quietly to each other about nothing in particular. What Vander was, more than the keeper of the tavern, was the steady center of his corner of the lanes. When there was a quarrel on the street, he was the one who came out and settled it, often with no more than a few quiet words and the long, calm weight of his presence. When a family in the lodgings above the tavern was short on rent at the end of a hard month, he was the one who quietly let it go for another week, and then for another, and the family knew, and the rest of the street knew, and no one made a thing of it. When the Chem Barons sent their men down into the lanes to lean on the small shops for whatever it was, they were leaning on the small shops for that month. Vander was the one who stood in the door of the tavern and looked at them in his slow, even way until they remembered, somehow, that they had other business to be about. He was not a violent man in those years. He had been, perhaps, in his earlier life, but he had set that part of himself down a long time ago, and the people of the lanes knew it, and they trusted him for it. In the rooms above the tavern, in those years, there were children. Some of them were Vander's own, in the long, quiet way that the lanes used the word. They were not all his by blood. They were children whose families, in one way or another, had not been able to keep them, and who had come, by the long, quiet paths that such children come by, to live above the tavern with the broad-shouldered man who looked after them. There was a girl named Vi, who was the oldest of them, with red hair and a quick temper that Vander spent a long, quiet patience helping her learn to set down. There was a younger sister named Powder, smaller and thinner, with pale hair and large eyes, and a quick, clever way, with her hands that surprised the adults around her almost daily. There were two boys, Milo and Clagger, who had come into the rooms above the tavern in their own ways, and who had, by the long, quiet stages by which such things happen, become brothers to the two sisters and sons to the broad-shouldered man. The four of them, in those years, were the small, loud life that filled the rooms above the tavern, and they were, in their own way, as much of a family as any family in either city. The days of the children, in those years, were the days of the lanes. They ran the long alleys of the middle level on errands for Vander and for the small shops nearby. They learned the long climb up to the promenade and the longer climb back down. They knew which of the cargo lifts they could ride for free if they were quick and quiet, and which of the lift keepers would clip them across the ear for trying. They knew the small markets where a hand-sized loaf of bread could be bought for almost nothing, and the slightly larger markets where the same loaf was twice the price. They were quick children, the way children of the lanes had always been quick, because the lanes did not give a child much time to be slow. And in the long evenings, when their errands were done and the tavern below was full of the low voices of the workers at the bar, the four of them would gather in the small rooms above and eat the slow suppers that Vander made for them. And they would talk in the half-bright, half-tired way that children talk after a long day. And the rooms above the tavern, on those evenings, were as quiet and as warm a place as any that the lower city held. There was, in the nearby streets, another child of about the same age, a boy named Echo, who lived with his own family a few corners away, and who came in and out of the rooms above the tavern often enough to count, in the long counting of such things, as one of the same set. He was clever with his hands in a way that even Powder, who was clever with her hands in her own quick way, would stop and watch. He could take a broken mechanism out of a heap of scrap and make it run again before the rest of them had figured out which way around it was supposed to go. He kept to himself more than the others did, and he had his own quiet ideas about things. But on the long, warm evenings, he would sit at the same table as the rest of them and eat the same slow supper, and he was, in his own quiet way, part of what the rooms above the tavern were. For a long while, the life of those rooms went on as it had always gone on, in the long, quiet rhythm of the lanes. The children grew. Vi grew tall and strong and learned, after long patience from Vander, to set down her temper before it got the better of her. Powder grew clever and sharp and stayed small for her age, and she made, in the long evenings, small, careful things out of bits of scrap, and she took them apart again, and she made them again, and she was happy, in the quiet way that careful makers are happy. Milo and Clagger grew into the gentle teasing brothers that families with brothers always have. Echo, in his corner, grew toward his own quiet work. The rooms above the tavern, in those years, held what they were meant to hold. And then, one night, the long, quiet rhythm broke. What happened that night is one of the longer and sadder threads in the story of the two cities, and the long telling of it does not need, here, to be drawn out at any length. There was a moment of the kind that comes sometimes to families in the lanes, a moment in which a small thing meant kindly went wrong in a way that no one could have meant, in a way that no one in the small rooms above the tavern could have foreseen. There was a sound, and there was a long quiet afterward. When the long quiet afterward had settled, the broad-shouldered man who had held the rooms together was gone. The two younger brothers were gone. The small, clever girl with the pale hair, who had not meant any of it and would carry that not meaning with her for the rest of her life, was left in the wreck of the small rooms with her older sister, who looked at her in the long, terrible silence and said one short word, the kind of word that an older sister says only once and never takes back, and then was gone too, taken up the long stairs to the upper city by hands that did not, in that moment, mean to be cruel and yet were, and the small, clever girl was left alone. That night ended, the way all nights end. The long gray morning came in over the broken cliffs, the way the long gray morning had once come in after the sundering, and the lanes went on. There were neighbors who came in the morning, and took quiet care of what had to be taken quiet care of. There were the small, careful kindnesses that the lanes had always known how to do for one another in such moments. And then the days that followed were the days that followed, and the lanes kept on, because the lanes did not have any other choice. The four children of the rooms above the tavern were never again the four children of the rooms above the tavern. The older sister, Vi, was taken to a long stone holding place on a small cold island in the harbor, where she stayed for years, and where the long quiet years did their long quiet work on her in the way that such years always do. She was a young woman of fierce loyalties when she went in, and she came out years later, a young woman of the same fierce loyalties, only harder set, with the slow, patient knowledge of a person who has learned, in a long stretch of silence, exactly who she is and what she is willing to bear. Her years there are not the kind of years that the long telling lingers on. They were what they were, and she came out of them in the end. And that is the most that can be said. The younger sister, Powder, did not stay long alone in the wreck of the small rooms. She was found, in the long gray morning, by a man of the lanes who had known Vander a long time, and who had once, in a much older story, been close to him, and who had since become something quite other than what Vander had become. His name was Silco, and he ran, in those years, a long, quiet trade of his own in the deepest parts of the lanes, a trade in the green glowing chemtech drafts that the lower city had begun to call by other names. He took the small, clever girl in. He kept her safe, in the way that he understood the keeping of children safe. He gave her, in time, his own kind of attention and his own kind of care, and the small, clever girl, who had no one else in the world by then, took what was given her, because that was what was there to take. The small, clever girl, by slow degrees, became someone else. The pale hair and the large eyes were the same. The quick, clever hands were the same. But the short word her older sister had said to her on the long night never quite left her, and she took the short word for her own, in time, and made it her name. By the time the long years had done their long work on her, she was no longer Powder. She was the name her sister had once said in that one short, terrible second, and she carried that name as a person carries a wound that has long since closed but still aches in the cold, and she made, with her quick, clever hands, things that were no longer the small, careful things of the small attic rooms, but louder things, brighter things, things that went off with a great deal of noise in the streets of the lanes, and that frightened the people they were meant to frighten and saddened the people who had once known her as the small girl with the pale hair. She was, by then, her own person, in her own difficult way, and she was loved by the strange man who had taken her in, and she loved him back, in her own difficult way, and that was the shape of the long years for her. The older sister, when at last she came out of the long stone holding place, came out into a lower city that was no longer quite the lower city she remembered. The streets had moved on without her. The corners had new keepers. The rooms above the tavern were long since let to other people, who knew nothing of what those rooms had once held. She walked the lanes for a while in the long, quiet way of a person trying to find her bearings, and in time she found, by accidents that the long telling will not bother to draw out, a new kind of work to do, a work that took her up the long stairs to the upper city more often than she had ever expected to climb them. And that put her, in time, in the company of a careful young woman from one of the cliff clans, whose long, quiet temperament turned out, after a long, slow getting used to each other, to fit with her own in ways neither of them had expected. The long story of that getting used to each other belongs to other parts of the night, and the long telling will come back to it in its own time. What matters here is that she did, in the end, find her feet again, in her own hard way. And the lower city, for her, did become again a place she could walk in. The boy from the nearby corner, Echo, did not leave the lanes the way the older sister had left them, or the way the younger sister had been taken in. He stayed. He kept his own quiet counsel through the years that followed. He gathered around him, slowly, a small group of other children of the lanes who had also lost more than children should have to lose, and he made for them, in a quiet corner of the lower city that no one else was using, a small, careful place of their own. The place had its lamps and its workshops and its long, quiet rooms, and the children who lived there called it by their own name, and they kept it safe, and they did, in their quiet way, what they could to keep the worst of the lanes from reaching the smallest of them. Echo himself in those years grew into the kind of careful young maker that Powder, once, had seemed to be on her way to becoming, and he made his own small, careful things in his own small, careful workshop, and the long telling of what he made will come back in time. There was, in those years, one other thing that came of the long night above the tavern, and it is the thing that the long telling has the most trouble holding lightly, and so the long telling will hold it shortly. The broad-shouldered man who had been Vander, who had gone down into the long quiet afterward of that night, did not stay, as the long telling at first had thought. Gone. Something was done with what was left of him, in a place far below the rooms above the tavern, in a workshop that the long telling of these years has its own slow reasons not to look at directly. What was done by a man whose name will come back later, in another chapter. And who did the doing for reasons of his own that the long telling will, in its own time, set out as gently as such reasons can be set out. What was made of what was left, in the end, was not the broad-shouldered man any longer. It was a wolf of a kind that walked on 2 legs and ran on 4, and that had somewhere far down inside it the long, quiet patience that had once been Vander's, and that did not, for a long time, remember its own name. The wolf went into the lanes, in time, and it did, in the lanes, what such a thing will do. The long telling will not draw the doing out. The wolf was what was left of Vander, and what was left of Vander was a hard thing for those who had loved him to carry, and they carried it, in their own ways, as they carried everything else. By the time the dust of those years had settled, the city above had a new generation of its own, and one of them wore the badge of a warden. The upper city, in those years, had long since grown out of the simple market town that it had once been on the edge of the cliffs. It had become, by the long, slow stages by which such things happen, a careful and complicated place, full of long-standing arrangements between long-standing families, full of small written rules that almost no one outside the cliff clans had ever had cause to read, full of the kind of quiet routine that a city only develops when it has been wealthy and at peace for a long time. The upper city was, by then, a city that ran itself the way a careful merchant runs his ledger, with a small number of well-thought-out entries and a great many small, unwritten understandings that everyone involved had long since agreed to honor. At the long, quiet center of all of this sat the council. The council was the body that, by long custom, was understood to speak for the upper city as a whole, and its seats were held, by the same long custom, by the heads of the most established of the cliff clans, and by a small number of others whose long service to the city had earned them a place at the long pale table at which the council met. The number of seats was not, in the long telling, a number that anyone bothered very often to count. The seats had been added one by one over a long stretch of years, and a few had been quietly let lapse, and a few new ones had been quietly added in their place, and the long pale table had grown a little longer once or twice, and the council went on much as it had always gone on, in its own slow, careful way. The clans whose heads sat at the long pale table were many, and each of them had its own long, quiet history, and each of them carried its own particular weight in the affairs of the city. There was Clan Medarda, whose long story had been bound up with the great gates at the edge of the cliffs since the gates were first built, and whose name was known well beyond the cliffs themselves, even in some of the distant cities far inland, where the Medarda dealings had spread by long, quiet paths through several generations. There was Clan Pharos, the keepers of certain long-held secrets to do with the small, pale crystals that the new art of the cliffs depended on. The clan whose long, careful patience and longer careful watching had given it, by the time of the story, a quiet authority over things that the other clans only half understood. There was Clan Halloran, an older clan than most of the others, careful and dignified, and not given to taking sides quickly. There was Clan Cadwalder, the long, careful makers of the small carts and the long-wheeled carriages that ran along the broad streets of the upper city, a clan that took its craft seriously and its dinners seriously and not much else. There was the Kiraman family, careful makers in their own quiet way, with a long association with the new art and a long line of careful daughters and sons. There were others, smaller in their holdings, but no smaller in their long, quiet pride. The Arvinos and the Geopara and the Tariost, each of them with their own small place at the long, pale table or near it. Each clan had its own sigil, the way the clans of the cliffs had always had their sigils, a small, careful mark in metal or in painted wood, set above their warehouse doors and stitched into the hems of the cloaks of their servants and pressed into the wax of their letters. A walker through the upper city on a long, quiet afternoon could read the sigils on the walls and the doors and the carts as they passed, and know, almost without thinking, which corner of the city they had walked into and whose long, quiet hand had built it. The clans were proud of their sigils in their own quiet way, and the upper city was proud of its clans, and the long, pale table at which the heads of the clans met was, for the upper city, the long, quiet center around which the rest of the daily life of the cliffs turned. The keeping of the order of the upper city, the long daily work of seeing to it that the broad streets stayed safe and the long ledgers stayed honest and the small daily quarrels of a wealthy city did not grow into anything larger, was the work of a long-standing body that the upper city called the Wardens. They were not soldiers, in the long telling. The upper city had no army to speak of and had never much wanted one. The Wardens were something quieter and more careful than soldiers. They walked the long, broad streets in their pale gray coats, and they kept their eye on the comings and goings of the markets, and they stepped in when a quarrel needed stepping in on, and they kept their long, careful records of the small things that happened, and they did, on the whole, what they were meant to do, and they did it, on the whole, well. The Wardens were paid for, by long custom, partly out of the taxes on the long sea trade, and partly out of the careful contributions of the cliff clans themselves. The cliff clans, in return for their careful contributions, were able to suggest, from time to time, the kinds of small instruments and small mechanisms that they thought the Wardens might find useful, and a small, steady stream of clever things made its way, in those years, from the workshops of the upper city into the long, careful belts of the Wardens on their patrols. Each Warden carried, in time, a small device of their own choosing, suited to the kind of work they did. The patrol Wardens carried the small, steady things suited to the walking of long, quiet streets. The Archive Wardens, who kept the long, careful records in the long, quiet rooms at the heart of the Warden's Hall, carried the small, precise things suited to that work. The few who handled the heavier work of the body carried the heavier things suited to that. Though the upper city, in those years, did not have very often a need for the heavier things to be taken out of their long, quiet cases. Above the Wardens, by long custom, stood a sheriff, the long, careful name for the one who saw to the running of the whole of the Warden's work, and who answered, when answer was called for, to the council itself. The sheriff in those years was a careful older figure of long, quiet service, of the kind of long, quiet service that the upper city had always preferred in its sheriffs, and the day-to-day affairs of the Wardens were largely left to the sheriff and to those whom the sheriff trusted. The long, quiet structure of the thing was such that the upper city, on most days, hardly noticed that it had a body of wardens at all, which was, in the end, exactly how the upper city had always wanted the matter to be. Among the new generation of wardens that had come of age by the time of the story, there was one in particular whom the long telling now turns to, because of the long quiet part that she came in time to play in the affairs of both cities. Her name was Caitlin, and she was of the Kiraman family, one of the careful older makers of the upper city, a family whose long association with the new art and with the affairs of the council had given it, by the time of the story, a quiet weight in the upper city that the family itself was not always entirely comfortable with. Caitlin had grown up in one of the long, pale houses of the cliff edge, with broad windows that looked out over the long sea, and she had grown up with all of the long, quiet expectations that such houses tend to place on their children. She had been taught her letters and her numbers by careful tutors. She had been taught the long, careful manners of the long, careful dinners of the cliff clans. She had been expected, in the long, quiet way that such children are expected, to take her own quiet place, in her own quiet time, at one of the long, pale tables of the city. Caitlin, in the long, quiet way of certain children of certain families, did not take to the long, quiet expectations of her family with the easy grace that the long, quiet expectations were used to. She took instead to the long, careful instrument that had hung above her father's mantelpiece for as long as she could remember. A long, careful rifle of the kind the careful older makers of the upper city had always made for the slow, patient art of marksmanship. She took to it first as a child, when she was allowed only to look at it, and then as a young person, when she was allowed at last to hold it, and then as a young woman, when she was allowed at last to take it down off the wall and to walk with it, in the long, quiet way her father had walked with it, out into the long, quiet hills above the cliffs, where the careful, older art of marksmanship was practiced by the few who still practiced it. She was, by the time she was grown, very good at the long, careful art, and she was, by the time she was grown, also very clear that what she wanted to do with her grown life was not what the long, pale houses of the cliff edge had been expecting her to do with it. What she chose to do, after a long, quiet conversation or two with her family that the long telling will not draw out, was to put on the pale gray coat of the wardens and to take her long, quiet place among them. She was not, in those years, the only young person of one of the cliff clans to do such a thing, but she was perhaps the most quietly determined of them, and she rose, by slow, careful stages, through the long, careful ranks of the wardens, until in time she was the kind of warden whom the older wardens turned to when there was a careful, difficult question to be looked into. The kind of warden whom the sheriff trusted to walk into a complicated street and to walk out of it again with the right, careful understanding of what had been going on there. It was in the long, careful course of one such complicated street, by the long, quiet accidents of the work, that she came in time to be partnered with the older sister of the small, clever girl, who had by then come out of the long stone holding place on the small, cold island, and was looking, in her own hard way, for a kind of work that fit her hands. The partnership was a slow, careful one. The two of them, at first, were not at all alike, and they did not at first agree on much of anything, and the long, careful tempers of each of them had to learn to make a long, careful space for the long, careful temper of the other. But the work itself, in time, taught them what the work always teaches such partners. They learned, by slow stages, to trust each other in the small, careful ways that the work calls for. They learned, by slower stages still, to trust each other in the larger, careful ways. The long telling does not, in this chapter, have anything more particular to say about the long, slow bond that grew between them, than that it was, by the time it had grown, the kind of long, slow bond that a long, quiet life of careful work together tends to build, and that it carried each of them, in time, through more than either of them, at the start, would have known how to carry alone. The two of them, working together, walked a great many of the long, broad streets of the upper city in those years, and a fair number of the long iron walkways of the lower city as well, when the careful work of the wardens called for it. The upper city, in those years, was still, on most days, the long, careful place it had always been, and the long, careful work of the wardens was still, on most days, the long, careful work of seeing to it that the long, careful place stayed as it was. There were long, quiet stretches of weeks in which nothing of any particular note happened at all, and the two of them walked the long, broad streets and the long iron walkways and kept their long, careful eye on things. And at the end of the day, they sat in one of the small, quiet places near the warden's hall and drank a small, careful drink together and went home to their own small, careful lives. And the upper city went on as the upper city had always gone on. The long, careful life of the council, all the while, went on in much the same way. The long, pale table met when it was called to meet, and the heads of the clans took their long, careful seats around it, and the long, careful matters of the upper city were discussed in the long, careful way, and the long, careful decisions were made in the long, careful way, and the long, pale table rose at the end of its sittings and went home to its own long, pale houses. There were quarrels at the long, pale table from time to time, the way there are always quarrels at the long, pale tables of cities like the upper city. But the quarrels were of the long, careful kind, the kind that move slowly through the long, careful corridors of the city for months, and sometimes for years, before they come to anything that anyone outside the long, pale table would notice. The upper city, for the most part, ran itself in those years, by the long, careful weight of its own long, careful habit, and the council and the wardens and the long, careful sheriff were the long, quiet shape of that habit. And the long, careful place went on being the long, careful place it had always been. And while the wardens kept their watch above, the lower city was governed by something older and rougher and far less written down. The thing that ran the lower city in the long years after the sundering was not exactly a thing that any single person had set out to make. It had gathered, the way many of the long shapes of the lower city had gathered, by slow accidents over a long stretch of years, out of the small daily needs of a place that the upper city had quietly stepped back from. With no council to oversee its affairs, with no body of pale-coated walkers to keep the long, quiet order of its streets, the lower city had found itself, in those long years, with a long, quiet space at the center of it, where some kind of holding together was needed, and the holding together had, in time, come from those who had the means to provide it and the willingness to charge, in their own way, for the providing. These were the men and the women who came to be called, in the long telling of the lower city, the Chem Barons. The name had not been theirs at first. In the early years, they had simply been the keepers of the larger workshops, the owners of the longer rope yards, the holders of the warehouses near the lifts where the goods of the lower city were gathered before they were sent up to the upper city for sale. They had been, in those early years, simply the well-off of the lower city, the ones who had a little more than the rest, and who used the little more to buy a little more again. They had grown, in the long, careful way that such people always grow, by quiet stages, until in time their holdings had stretched across whole levels of whole canyons, and their long, quiet word in their own corners of the lower city had become, by long use, the long, quiet word that decided what happened in those corners. What had pulled all of this together, in the end, into a single class of people that the rest of the lower city could give a single name to, was the long, quiet trade in the green-glowing chemtech drafts that the lower city had begun to make in larger and larger quantities in the long years after the sundering. The art of the chemtech had grown up in the lower city the way the art of the hextech had grown up in the upper one, but with a great deal less of the long, patient teaching that the College of the Cliffs had given to its students. The chemtech art was a quicker art, a rougher art, the art of clever workers who had not had the long, expensive years at a long, pale bench, but who had learned by long, slow trial and long, slow error what could be coaxed out of the strong chemicals of the lower city if a person were willing to coax. The things that the chemtech art could make were not, in many cases, gentle things. They lit lamps, yes. They turned mechanisms, yes. But they also did other things, things that the upper city would not have allowed under the long, careful eye of its council, and the lower city, with no such long, careful eye watching, allowed them. And the long, quiet trade in them grew, and the people who held the long, quiet trade in their hands grew with it. The chem barons, by the time the long telling turns to them properly, were the long, quiet holders of that trade. There were not very many of them in the end. Each held a corner of the lower city as a kind of long, quiet kingdom, and the corners did not, on most days, overlap in ways that called for trouble. They met from time to time in long, quiet rooms somewhere in the middle of the lower city, where the lamps were brighter and the rugs were thicker than the lamps and the rugs in the rest of the lanes. And they sat across long tables from one another and worked out, in their own long, quiet way, the long, quiet arrangements by which the lower city kept on going. The arrangements were not, in any sense that the long, pale table of the upper city would have recognized, a government. But they were what the lower city had, and they did, in their own way, hold the lower city together. And the people of the lanes, by long custom, paid the small daily prices that such an arrangement asks of those who live under it. Of the figures who held those long, quiet kingdoms, the long telling will name only a few, and will hold each of them at a careful low distance, in the way that the long telling has held the harder figures of the lower city throughout. The first, and in the long years the wealthiest of them, was a woman by the name of Renata Glashk. Her story was a long and a sad one in its beginnings, the kind of long, sad beginning that the lower city had, in those years, more than its share of. She had been born, the long story goes, to a careful older couple of the lanes who had given their long, careful lives to the slow, patient work of making small chemical cures and giving them away free to those who could not pay for them. The careful older couple had been beloved on their own quiet street, and they had been less beloved by certain quiet people in the upper city, who, by long, careful arrangements that the long telling will not draw out, saw to it that the careful older couple did not, in the end, live out the long, quiet lives that the lanes had expected them to live. The young Renata, when the careful older couple were gone, was left with very little except for a single hard lesson. The lesson that the long, patient giving away of things did not, in the lower city, keep a person safe. She took that lesson, and she carried it with her, and she did with it what such lessons sometimes drive a person to do. She built, from what little she had been left with, a long, quiet trade of her own, in the careful chemical things her parents had given away free. She did not give them away. She sold them, and she sold them well, and she set the prices in such a way that those who could afford her wares paid more than enough to make up for those who could not. And over a long stretch of careful years, she built her holdings into one of the long, quiet kingdoms of the lower city, and then into the largest of them. By the time the long telling turns to her, she was the wealthiest of the chem barons, and her name was known across both cities, and the long, quiet weight of her holdings reached in places up into the affairs of the upper city itself. She was a careful figure in the long telling, the kind of figure who preferred the slow, patient turn of a long arrangement to the quicker turn of a small quarrel, and the lower city had learned, by the long, quiet years, to deal with her in the careful, patient way she preferred. The other chem barons of the long, quiet rooms, the long telling will name only briefly, because most of them, in the long, honest accounting, are figures whose long histories the long telling does not entirely know. There were the long-standing baronies of certain older holdings, whose families had run the same long, quiet kingdoms for generations, and whose names were spoken in the lanes with a long, quiet wariness that the long telling will not try to imitate. There were the newer baronies, the ones that had risen in the long, careful turn of the last generation, whose holders had come up out of the lanes themselves and had taken, by their own long, careful work, their long, quiet places at the long, quiet tables. There were the smaller baronies at the edges, whose holders held only a few streets or a single corner of a single level, and who attended the long, quiet meetings less often, and who were, in the long, quiet calculations of the larger holders, mostly left alone. All of them, taken together, were the long, quiet body that ran the lower city in those years, and they ran it as they wished. And the lower city, for the most part, lived under their long, quiet running because there was no other long, quiet running to be had. The long, quiet trade that all of them depended on, in those years, had a name in the lower city, and the long-telling will set the name down here only once and then move past it. It was called Shimmer, and it was a long, careful refinement of certain of the Chemtech drafts, and it was, by the time the long telling turns to it, the long, quiet center around which the long, quiet kingdoms of the lower city turned. The long telling will not draw out what it did to the people who took it, beyond noting that it did to them what such things have always done to those who take them, and that the long, quiet trade in it was a trade that the long telling does not, in the end, have anything kind to say about. Those who profited from it profited a great deal. Those who did not profit from it paid, in their own long, quiet ways, the prices that such trades always ask the rest of a city to pay, and the lower city carried those prices, the way the lower city had always carried such things, in its own long, quiet way. There was, behind the long, quiet trade in the green glowing draft, a figure whose name the long telling has already promised to come back to. The man who had done in the long ago, the doing that had made of what was left of Vander what walked the lanes afterward. He was a careful older maker of the lower city, of a kind that the lower city had a number of in those years. The kind of careful older maker who had taken the long, careful arts of the workbench and the long, careful arts of the Chemtech, and joined them together in his own quiet workshop, and asked of the joining things that other careful makers would not have asked. He was a quiet figure in his own way, the long telling will say. He kept to himself. He worked at his long, quiet bench. The work he did was the work that the long, quiet trade in the green glowing draft had needed done, and the long, quiet trade had paid him for it, in the long, quiet currency that such trades pay in, and he had spent the payment on the further work of his long, quiet bench. The long telling will say only that the careful older maker had, somewhere in his long, quiet past, a careful older grief of his own, a grief that he carried with him into every careful thing he did, and that the long telling will, in its own time and in another chapter, set out the long, quiet shape of that grief, because the careful older grief is, in the end, the only part of him that the long telling has the heart to dwell on. For now, he was a figure in the lower city, and his work was the work he did, and the long telling, in the careful way of such things, turns its eye softly aside. There was another figure of the lower city in those years, of whom the long telling will say only a little, because the long telling does not have, in all honesty, very much to say. He was a large man, the long stories of the lower city tell, who had once been a careful enforcer for one of the older baronies, and who had been taken, in a long, careful course of doings that the long telling will not try to set down, to one of the long, quiet places in the lower city, where the kinds of things were done that the long telling has been turning its eye softly aside from throughout this chapter. What came out of that long, quiet place was no longer quite the large man who had been taken in. He was something stranger and something harder to look at, and the Lanes, in the long years afterward, spoke of him in the way the Lanes had always spoken of certain figures they only half believed in. The kind of figure whose name parents told their children in the late evenings to keep the children indoors. The long telling will not say more of him than that. The Lanes told what the Lanes told, and the long telling, in the careful way of such things, lets the Lanes tell it in their own way and moves on. And there was, far down in the deepest of the lower levels, in one of the long, quiet pits where the older baronies had once kept the workers they did not wish to keep above, a long, quiet story of a figure who had come up out of the pit, in the long ago, in a way the pit had not been built to allow. The long telling will not draw the long, quiet story out. It will say only that the pit, in the end, did not hold what the pit had thought it was holding, and that the lower city in the long years afterward had, for a while, to learn to live with what had come up out of it, and that what had come up out of it was, in the end, a figure that the lower city set down its own long, quiet stories about, and that the long telling will let those long, quiet stories rest where the Lanes have always let them rest, in the long, quiet places where such stories belong. These were the figures of the long, quiet rooms of the lower city in those years, and these were the long, quiet kingdoms they held. The long telling has set them down as briefly as it can, because the long telling has, throughout this chapter, been careful not to look any of them too long in the face. The lower city, under their long, quiet running, was, in many of its corners, a hard place to live. It was also, in many of its corners, a place that went on living, day by day, in the long, quiet way that the lower city had always gone on living. The workers of the long workshops went to their long benches in the morning and came home from their long benches in the evening. The small shops of the long streets opened their long doors at dawn and closed them again at dusk. The lifts ran. The lamps were lit. The long, quiet kingdoms of the long, quiet rooms held what they held, and the lower city, under them, did what the lower city had always done, which was to keep on, in its own long, quiet way, regardless. There were other figures in the lower city, quieter ones, who did not seek power and were not sought by it. The lower city, even in the long years when the long, quiet rooms of the Chem Barons held most of its running, had always also held a great many people who had nothing at all to do with the long, quiet rooms. The long, quiet rooms were the long, quiet rooms. The rest of the lower city was the rest of the lower city, and the rest of the lower city was, by every count anyone had ever tried to make of it, much the larger part of the place. In the rest of the lower city, there were the long, quiet lives of the workers and the small shopkeepers and the careful older makers who had no holdings worth a baron's noticing, and there were, here and there, the long, quiet figures of whom the long telling now turns to, for whom the lower city had, in time, made its own kind of room. The first of them, of whom the long telling has already spoken in passing, was the boy from the nearby corner, Echo, who had grown by then into the careful young maker that the long evenings above the tavern had once half promised. He kept by then, in a long, quiet corner of one of the middle levels, a place of his own, a place that had been, in some earlier life, a small warehouse that no one had bothered to use for a long time. He and the small, careful group of other young people who had come to live there had cleaned it out, in the long, careful way of people with no money and a great deal of time, and they had set up their long, careful workshops along its walls, and they had run new lamps along the long ceiling beams, and they had made of it, by long, slow stages, the kind of place that a child of the lanes could come to in the late evenings and find warmth and a careful meal and a quiet bench to work at. The long, careful group of them did not, by long, quiet choice, ask much of the wider lower city, and the wider lower city, by the long, quiet courtesy of leaving certain quiet things alone, did not ask much of them in return. Echo himself in those years was at work on a long, careful question that had taken hold of him in his earliest years and had never quite let him go. The question had to do with time, and with the long, quiet way that time runs through the lives of those who live in it, and with whether time, like the long, careful waits of the long, careful clocks of the upper city, might one day be persuaded to run a little differently for a little while. He did not, in those years, expect that the question would come to anything in particular. He worked at it slowly in the long evenings, the way a careful older maker works at the careful older problem of his life, without rushing, without expecting, with the long, quiet patience that careful makers learn over the long years of their work. The long telling will say only that the long, careful question did, in time, begin to give him certain long, careful answers, and that what he did with those answers, in the years that followed, was the kind of long, careful doing that the long telling has its own reasons to set down gently and to set down later in another part of the story, and not tonight. There was, in another part of the lower city, in a long, quiet workshop that had been built into one of the older buildings near the promenade, a careful older maker of a different kind altogether. He was a maker of careful brass things, of the slow, precise kind, the kind of careful brass things that the upper city in the long ago had built its early fame on. He had been, in his own long ago, a maker in the upper city itself, with a long, quiet workshop on a long, pale street near the cliff edge. And his careful brass things had been spoken of, in those long ago years, in the careful older houses where such things were spoken of. He had a daughter in those long ago years, a careful, clever girl who took to his careful brass things the way some children take to drawing, and who would sit beside him at his long bench through the long evenings and watch the slow, patient turn of his careful older hands and try, with her own small, careful hands, to do what those hands did. He loved her in the long, careful way that careful older makers love a careful, clever child, and she loved him in the same long, careful way, and the long, quiet workshop on the long, pale street was, in those long ago years, as warm a place as any in either city. Something happened, in time, to the careful, clever girl. The long telling will not draw it out, because the long telling does not need to. She was, in the long after of what happened, no longer able to be what she had been, and her careful older father, who could not bear that, set to work in his own long, careful way on the long, careful question of how a careful, clever girl might be made, by the careful older arts of the workbench, to go on. He made, in the long, careful way of such grief, the things that grief drives careful older makers to make. He made for her a careful brass lung, and then a careful brass set of careful brass bones, and then, in time, careful brass replacements for almost everything that had failed in her, until what walked in the long, quiet workshop, in the long after, was a careful brass figure with the long, quiet eyes of the careful, clever girl looking out of it. And the careful older father was beside himself with the long, careful joy and the long, careful sorrow of having done what he had done. The long, careful joy and the long, careful sorrow, in time, were more than the long, quiet workshop on the long, pale street could hold. And the careful older father took the careful brass figure of his daughter and went down into the lower city, where the careful older arts of the workbench were not asked the kinds of questions that the upper city had begun to ask of him. And he settled there, in the long, quiet workshop near the promenade, and he kept on with his long, careful work. It is said, in the long, quiet rooms above his workshop, that the careful brass figure of his daughter played, in the long evenings, a small, careful music. It is said that he had built into her, in his long, careful grief, a small, careful music box of his own design, and that the careful brass figure could be wound with a careful brass key, and that when she was wound, she would turn slowly in the long, quiet room, and the small, careful music would play out into the long, quiet evening, and that the careful older father, sitting at his long bench, would listen and would not say anything, and would only listen, and that the long, quiet rooms above the workshop knew, in their own long, quiet way, that the small, careful music was the long, careful sound of a long, careful love that had outlasted what it had loved. The long telling does not have anything more to say about the careful older maker and the careful brass figure of his daughter than that. The long telling sets them down in their long, quiet workshop, with the small, careful music playing in the long evening, and the long telling turns gently away. There was, on a long platform built out into one of the wider parts of the entresol, in those years, a young woman who sang. She had been born in the upper city, to a careful older couple who had come up out of the lower city long before she was born, and who had built, in the upper city, a small careful shop where the careful older instruments of music could be repaired, and the small careful sounds of those instruments could be set right again when they had gone wrong. She had grown up among those small careful sounds, and she had grown up, in time, with a long quiet gift of her own. The gift of hearing in the air around her certain long quiet sounds that other people did not hear. The sounds of what the people around her were carrying inside themselves. The sounds of the long quiet feelings and the long quiet hopes and the long quiet sorrows that the people around her did not always know how to set down in words. The gift was, in her earliest years, a great deal to carry. The careful older couple, her parents, in their long, careful love, saw what she carried, and they helped her, in their own careful older way, to learn to set the carrying down for a while when she needed to. In time, she learned to use the gift the other way, the way that a careful older maker learns to use a long, careful tool. She built, with the help of her parents, the long, careful art of singing on the long platform built out into the wider parts of the entresol. The long, careful art of taking what she heard in the air around her and giving it back to the air in the form of a long, careful song. The songs she sang, on the long evenings she sang them, drifted out into both cities at once, because the long platform she stood on had been built in such a way that the upper city above could hear her as easily as the lower city around her. And the long, careful songs went up the long stone walls and down the long stone walls in equal measure. And the long evenings on which she sang were, in the long telling of the lower city, some of the long quiet evenings the lower city looked forward to most. There were, in those years, a few other long quiet figures who had come to the lower city by long, quiet paths of their own, and who had, in the long, quiet way of the lower city, found their own long, quiet places in it. There was a large, careful figure of soft green who had come by a long, quiet course of chemical accidents that the long telling will not draw out, into a long, quiet sentience of his own, and who lived in the long years after, in the long, quiet pipes of the lower city, and who came out from time to time to help those who could not help themselves, and who was, by the long, quiet courtesy of the lower city, simply allowed to be what he was. There was a tall, careful figure of brass and steam who had been built in some long ago for the long, quiet work of the lower chemical seams, and who had, by the long, careful patience of his long, careful makers, come to his own long, quiet choice of what to do with the long, careful hours of his days, and who walked the lanes in those years on long, quiet errands of his own choosing. And there was, far above all of them, on certain long, quiet evenings when the wind off the harbor was right, an old, long, quiet figure who had once, in the long ago of the sundering, come in across the bay and held back for a while, the worst of what the sea was doing. The long telling has spoken of her once already, in passing, in the long telling of the sundering itself. The lower city, in the long years that followed, had not forgotten her. There were small, careful images of her in the long, quiet niches of certain long, quiet walls of the entresol, and there was a long, careful statue of her in one of the small, careful squares of the lower city, and on certain long, quiet evenings, the sailors of the lower harbor would, by long, quiet habit, look up at the night sky over the long, quiet bay and say a small, careful word to her in their own long, quiet way. And the long, quiet word was a word of thanks for the long, careful watching that the lower city had long believed she had never quite stopped doing. These were the long, quiet figures and the long, quiet beliefs that the lower city had made room for in itself in those years. They were not the long, quiet kingdoms of the long, quiet rooms. They were the long, quiet other thing that lived alongside the long, quiet kingdoms. The long, quiet other thing that the lower city had always made room for and would, in the long, quiet way of such cities, always go on making room for. The long telling sets them down here gently, as it has set down everything else in this part of the night. And the long telling turns now, in its own long, quiet way, toward the long, quiet end of the long, quiet story it has been telling. And above all of it, day after day, the same small rhythms of the cities went on, much as they always had. The day in the cities, in those long years and in the long years that came after them, began the way it had always begun, with the slow turn of the light coming up out of the long sea to the east. The upper city was the first to feel it. The long, pale houses along the cliff edge caught the first of it on their tall windows, and the long, pale streets caught the second of it as it ran down their long, quiet stones. And by the time the light had reached the broad squares behind the cliff edge, the lamps along the cliff edge had gone out, one by one, in the long, careful order in which they were always put out, and the long, quiet morning had settled in over the upper city, and the upper city had begun, in its own long, quiet way, to stir. In the long, pale houses, the long, quiet servants drew back the long, quiet curtains and let the long, quiet light in, and the long, careful clans of the long, quiet houses rose from their long, careful beds and took their long, careful breakfasts in the long, careful rooms in which they had always taken them. And the long, careful conversations of the long, careful breakfasts began in their long, careful way, much as they had begun on the day before and on the day before that. In the long, quiet workshops along the long, pale streets, the long, careful makers came in from wherever they had spent the night and lit their long, careful lamps above their long, careful benches and laid out their long, careful tools in the long, careful order they had always laid them out in, and set themselves down to their long, careful work, in the long, quiet way that the long, careful work of the upper city had always been done. Down at the long, careful harbor, in the long, quiet bay below, the long, careful boats had begun to come in on the morning tide, the way the long, careful boats had always come in on the morning tide. The long, careful sailors moved on the long, careful decks in the long, quiet way of sailors who have come in many mornings. The long, careful porters at the long, careful jetties took the long, careful ropes that were thrown down to them and made the long, careful boats fast to the long, careful posts. The long, careful goods of the long, careful boats began to be brought up onto the long, careful jetties in the long, careful order in which they had always been brought up. The long, careful clerks of the long, careful merchants came down from their long, quiet offices above the long, careful warehouses and stood on the long, careful jetties with their long, careful ledgers open in their long, careful hands. And they wrote down, in the long, careful way, what had come in on each long, careful boat. And they thanked the long, careful sailors in the long, careful way, and the long, careful boats, when they were unloaded, were tied to the long, careful posts to rest, until the long, careful tide should turn and take them out again. The long, careful lifts at the edge of the cliffs, in the long, quiet morning, had begun their long, careful day of going up and going down. The first of the long, careful lifts of the morning carried the long, careful workers of the lower city up to the long, careful jobs they held in the long, careful workshops of the upper city. The long, careful workers who had risen in the long, quiet dark of the lower city and made their long, careful breakfasts in their long, careful lodgings and walked their long, careful streets to the long, careful lifts and stood in the long, careful crowd of them, in the long, quiet hum of the lift cables, waiting for the long, careful ascent to begin. The long, careful lifts, in turn, came down again with the long, careful goods of the upper city, the long, careful sacks of the long, careful bakers, and the long, careful crates of the long, careful workshops, and the long, careful bundles of the long, careful merchants, all of which had to be brought down, in the long, careful way, to the long, careful corners of the lower city in which they would be sold and used and eaten and worn in the long, careful course of the long, quiet day. In the long, quiet middle of the lower city, in the long, careful streets of the entresol, the long, careful day had begun in its own long, quiet way. The long, quiet lamps along the long, iron walkways had begun in the long, careful order to be dimmed for the day, and the long, careful light from above had begun in the long, careful way to come down through the long, quiet vents and to settle on the long, iron railings of the long, quiet streets in the long, careful, slanting bars that the people of the lower city had grown up with and had long taken, in their own long, quiet way, for sunlight. The long, quiet shops of the long, careful streets had opened their long, careful doors, and the long, careful smells of the long, careful bread of the long, careful bakers had begun to drift down the long, careful corners, and the long, careful workers of the long, quiet workshops had taken up their long, careful tools, and the long, quiet middle of the lower city had begun, in its own long, quiet way, to be at work. Further down, in the long, quiet deep of the sump, the long, careful day had also begun, in the long, quiet way of the long, quiet deep. The long, careful lamps along the long, quiet walkways of the sump were not put out in the morning, because there was, in the sump, no morning of the kind that put out lamps. The long, quiet lamps stayed lit, in the long, careful green that the long, quiet lamps of the sump had always been lit in, and the long, careful workers of the sump rose in the long, quiet green and took their long, careful breakfasts in the long, quiet green and walked their long, careful streets in the long, quiet green to the long, careful workshops in which they spent the long, quiet hours of their long, careful days. The long, quiet deep of the sump, in the long, careful way, was not a place that needed the morning to know that the day had begun. The day in the sump had begun the way the day in the sump had always begun, with the long, quiet lamps and the long, careful walking and the long, careful settling in at the long, careful benches. The long, careful middle of the day, in both cities, was the long, quiet middle. In the upper city, the long, careful clans took their long, careful midday meals in the long, careful rooms in which they had always taken them, and the long, careful clerks took their long, careful meals at their long, careful desks, and the long, careful workers of the long, careful workshops took their long, careful meals at their long, careful benches, and the long, quiet midday went on in its own long, quiet way, with the long, careful light from above, falling on the long, pale stones of the long, careful streets and the long, careful gulls turning in the long, quiet way of gulls above the long, quiet bay. In the lower city, the long, careful midday was the long, careful hour at which the long, careful markets of the entresol filled with the long, careful crowd of the long, careful workers from the long, careful workshops nearby, and the long, careful smells of the long, careful food of the long, careful market stalls drifted up the long, iron walkways, and the long, careful hum of the long, careful conversations rose to a long, careful steadiness that lasted for the long, careful hour. And then, in the long, careful way, the long, careful workers went back to the long, careful workshops, and the long, careful midday settled back down to its long, quiet middle. The long, careful afternoon, in both cities, was the long, careful afternoon. The long, careful boats at the long, careful harbor were unloaded in the long, careful way, and the long, careful goods of the long, careful boats were brought up in the long, careful way into the long, careful warehouses of the upper city, and the long, careful clerks of the long, careful merchants closed their long, careful ledgers for the long, careful afternoon and opened them again only when the long, careful goods of the next long, careful boat were brought up in the long, careful way onto the long, careful jetties. The long, careful workshops of the upper city in the long, careful afternoon were at their long, careful work, and the long, careful workshops of the lower city were at their long, careful work. And the long, careful lifts at the edge of the cliffs went up and went down in the long, careful way, and the long, careful day in both cities was at its long, quiet height. In time, in the long, careful way, the long, careful light from above began to go. It went slowly, the way the long, careful light from above had always gone. The long, pale houses along the cliff edge caught the long, careful gold of it on their tall windows, and the long, pale streets caught the long, careful gold of it as it ran down their long, quiet stones. And the long, careful sea below the long, careful cliffs went the long, careful color that the long, careful sea always went at that long, careful hour of the long, careful day. The long, careful gulls of the long, careful bay turned for the long, careful last time and settled in the long, careful way on the long, careful water. The long, careful boats at the long, careful harbor were tied in the long, careful way to the long, careful posts. The long, careful lamps along the cliff edge began, in the long, careful order in which they had always been lit, to be lit one by one, in the long, careful gold of the long, careful failing light. and the long careful lamps along the long iron walkways of the lower city began, in the long careful order, to come up out of their long quiet dimming and to settle in the long careful way, into the long careful green that the long quiet evening of the lower city had always settled into. The long careful workers of the long careful workshops, in both cities, set down their long careful tools, in the long careful order in which they had always set them down. The long careful clerks of the long careful merchants closed their long careful ledgers in the long careful way, and put on their long careful coats, and went home, in the long careful way, to their long careful lodgings. The long careful crowd of the long careful workers of the upper city, who had come up in the long careful morning from the long careful lower city, took the long careful lifts at the edge of the cliffs back down, in the long careful evening, to the long careful lodgings of the long careful lower city in which they had always lived. The long careful lifts hummed in the long careful way they had always hummed, and the long careful descent into the long careful evening of the lower city was the long careful descent it had always been, and the long careful workers in the long careful crowd stood in the long careful quiet of the long careful descent, and looked at the long careful green coming up to meet them, and thought, in the long careful way of long careful workers, at the long careful end of a long careful day, of the long careful suppers waiting for them at home. The long careful evening of the long careful entresol was the long careful evening it had always been. The long careful markets of the long careful streets stayed open in the long careful gold and green light, and the long careful smells of the long careful food of the long careful market stalls drifted in the long careful way, up the long iron walkways and down the long iron walkways, and the long careful music of the long careful music halls began, in the long careful way, to drift out of the long careful doors of the long careful music halls into the long careful streets. On the long platform built out into the wider parts of the entresol, on certain long careful evenings, the long careful young woman of whom the long telling has spoken sang her long careful songs into the long careful air of both cities, and the long careful songs drifted up the long stone walls and down the long stone walls, in the long careful way, and the long careful people of both cities, on those long careful evenings, paused, in the long careful way, to listen, and then went on, in the long careful way, with whatever long careful thing they had been doing before. The long careful evening went on, in the long careful way it had always gone on. The long careful night, in time, came down over both cities. The long careful lamps along the cliff edge were tended, in the long careful way, by the long careful keepers of the long careful lamps, and the long careful lamps along the long iron walkways were tended in the long careful way by the long careful keepers of the long careful walkways, and the long careful houses of the upper city went in the long careful order to their long careful suppers, and the long careful lodgings of the lower city went in the long careful order to theirs. The long careful sounds of the long careful workshops of both cities began, in the long careful way, to fade. The long careful workers, having taken their long careful suppers, took, in the long careful way, to their long careful beds. The long careful clerks, having closed their long careful ledgers for the long careful night, took, in the long careful way, to theirs. The long careful music of the long careful music halls of the entresol slowed, in the long careful way, and quieted, in the long careful way, and at last, in the long careful way, fell into the long careful silence that the long careful entresol had always settled into, in the long careful late hours. In the long careful harbor of the upper city, The long, careful boats rocked in the long, careful way on the long, careful water. In the long, careful streets of the upper city, the long, careful lamps along the cliff edge held in the long, careful way against the long, careful dark. In the long, careful streets of the lower city, the long, careful lamps along the long iron walkways held in the long, careful way against the long, careful dark. The long, careful gulls of the long, careful bay slept in the long, careful way on the long, careful water. The long, careful houses of the long, careful cliffs slept in the long, careful way behind their long, careful curtains. The long, careful lodgings of the long, careful lower city slept in the long, careful way behind their long, careful doors. The long, careful workshops in both cities were quiet in the long, careful way. The long, careful lifts at the edge of the cliffs were still in the long, careful way. The long, careful sea below the long, careful cliffs moved in the long, careful way and made the long, careful sound it had always made in the long, careful way against the long, careful base of the long, careful stone. And so the cities settled, as they always did, into the long quiet of the night. That is the story for tonight. The cities are old, and they will be there in the morning, and they will be there in the morning after that, and the long quiet rhythms of the long careful days will go on in the long careful way, whether anyone is listening or not. There is nothing more to follow, and nothing more to remember. The lamps along the cliff edge will hold against the dark for as long as they are needed, and the long iron walkways of the lower city will hold against the dark in their own way, and the long careful sea below the long careful stone will keep on making the long careful sound it has always made. Sleep well.